everybody. Today we're going to make a robust vanilla porter. Right now we have the water getting up to about 168 degrees because when we add that to the grains, that's going to drop the temperature to right around 154, which is right where we want it to be. This is just going to be a single step mash, so we aren't going to try and mess around with any other temperatures. We're just going to try and keep it right at 154. The ingredients to a porter are usually some sort of a pale ale grain, maybe a Maris Otter. I'm actually going to be showing the recipe right here, but basically you've got Munich malts, chocolate malts, some sort of a black malt or roasted malt in there to be able to give it all that color, and then just a pale malt as your base. So once we got this up to temperature, I'll take it on out there and we'll add the grains to it. Alright, so we're about to add the grains to the water. I put it in there at about 170 degrees. Once I add these grains, we should drop that temperature quite a bit. Here's our hops today. We're going to be using some Goldings. We won't add that until the boil though later on. Here's some of our dark grains. I'm actually not going to add that until the very end of the mash because sometimes the acids from that can kind of mess up the pH in here, and it'll make it so we don't get quite as many sugars that we want off the other grains. So I'll show you those in a second, but for now we've got a couple of vanilla beans too. Alright, for now we've got these grains right here. Those are just your regular base 2-row pale malt grain. So I'm going to start adding that in. The trick is you got to keep it moving really fast because it tends to ball up into a little, they'll call it a dough ball, if you don't have everything spinning pretty fast. So I'm going to start adding that in here and making sure that I get everything stirred up real well. That's looking pretty good. We'll just keep doing this a little bit more, and then I'll give it I'll probably stir it around for another 2 or 3 minutes just to make sure there's no little dough balls in there, and that we got all the surface areas getting touched by water. And then we'll check the temperature. Sometimes we're off by a degree or two. If that's the case, then I can just simply go get some hot water. If I'm a little too hot, then I can just leave the top off and keep stirring, and it'll drop the temperature because the garage here is fairly cool. It's probably in the upper 50s, so it's easy to lose a degree or two. Picking up a degree or two, I'll just go get some nearly boiling water to add to it. So and that is our mash. Here in a minute, I'll show you towards the end of this. We're going to start draining some of the sweet sugars off of this, but we're going to let this sit at this temperature for about an hour to be able to pull off all those sugars. So next step will be the mash out, and then we'll sparge. Alright, so we've had this the hot mash going for about 55 minutes. So it's about time to add those dark grains that I was talking about. We didn't want to add them too early because that would have messed up the pH. But now it's been held. This mash has been held at about 154 degrees for the full 55 minutes. So it's time to add those. Check it out. It has a really nice kind of coffee smell to it, a little bit chocolatey. So I'm going to keep mixing this in. We're going to make sure that's all stirred into there. And we're just going to only give that let that sit in there for about the last 5 minutes of this mash. All mixed in, and it's amazing how much color and flavor we will get out of those 5 minutes of the dark grains being mixed into there. So I will just leave this now that it's been all stirred. I just took the temperature a little earlier, and it was still holding at about 154, kind of almost teetering on 155. So that probably got it right where we want it to be. We'll give that another 5 minutes, and then it's time to mash out. All right, so it's about time to start taking the mash out of here. We're gonna get those sugary waters. The thing is, when we first start pouring it out, there's gonna be a lot of debris that kind of comes through there, little bits. So we do what is called the Vorlauf pour, and it's a great word. All it means is that we take those first few runnings and we pour them back in slowly on top of the mash. And what will happen is all those grains will keep settling and settling and settling until you eventually, they become sort of a filter for you. So we're going to start out over here with these first runnings, and they should be real murky. So it's nothing that you would really want to be able to use for your brew. And especially for something like a porter, we can see there's lots of little bits and chunks in there, and nothing that we'd want to end up having as a finished product. But this is going to run through for a minute. And we can say right around there. I'll turn it off. And we'll pour that back into the top, but we have to pour it very gently into the top. I usually like to use a spoon. Some people will put a colander or something like that over the top. I don't think for this one it's not going to be terribly necessary. I'm able to get a pretty good spread so that we just don't want the, when I pour, for it to drill a hole right through that grain bed again, because otherwise it's kind of wasting our time. So we're going to do this about 3 times here to kind of establish that grain bed, and that's going to be our filter. So it'll be the same thing 3 or 4 times through, and then we're going to switch over to sparging. Alright, so we've been pouring off some of the sugary waters here, doing the mash out. So you can come over and see down in there we've already got maybe 1.5 gallons of real nice sugary water. It's still coming out right now. You can see down here in the grain bed though that there's not a whole lot of liquid still rising up there. We actually have probably about half of this still has liquid in it. I prefer not to let it completely go dry. A lot of people when they sparge, actually they don't even like to have the grains outside of the liquid at all. I don't mind it getting about halfway down. So I'm going to shut this off. And we're going to add our sparge water. This right now is at about 175. Once it hits those grains, it'll be at about 170. The thing with 170-degree water means that it's going to shut down all of the enzymes. So all the enzymes that are in there breaking down the proteins and turning them into these sugars, they're all going to stop, which is what we want. So we want them to stop, and we want to kind of rinse the sugars off, which is exactly what this water is going to do. So we're going to add this into there, give it a stir. I'm going to give it a few minutes for those enzymes to completely shut down. Give it a stir here. And then we'll end up doing another one of those Vorlauf pours off of this a few times, because we've now, of course, disturbed this this grain bed, so we don't have that filter anymore. We need to reestablish that filter at the bottom with the grains. And now we'll be pouring off those last sugars. So this should get us to where we've taken just about all the sugars that we can out of those grains. And I'll even, in the meantime, I'm going to end up throwing some hops into here. That's a good idea at the very beginning, because you're able to get a lot of the aromas out of the actual hops, as well as some extra bittering. So I will end up throwing in a bag of hops while this is soaking, and then we'll pour that out. Alright, so while that hot sparge water is in there soaking, we're going to add these hops. So in the case of this porter, we're actually only adding Golding hops. They're very light alpha acid, so they're not very bitter. They give a nice little flavor to it. And so we're just adding about 2 ounces of that. So I like to work with whole cone hops. So you can see these are actually the whole hops. They haven't been crushed into pellets or anything. I figure if you're living in Eugene, Oregon, you might as well go with whole cone because we can get them. So I'm going to put them into this screen bag here. That's going to help keep a lot of the big chunks from getting into our brew here. Although little flakes are going to make their way out. It's not a big deal. They'll end up settling into the bottom. You end up with a bunch of stuff at the bottom that you just call trub. It's another great word. So, yep, no biggie there. We'll just tie this thing off here, and it'll go into there, into the brew, and it's gonna wait for the rest of this liquid to enter. And I will probably turn on the fire right now because it's gonna take a little while for this to get up to full heat so that we can get a good boiling going. So there we go, we're ready to go. It's in there now. I'll even press that down. And in just a minute here, I'm going to start doing that whole Vorloff pour and pour the rest of that liquid out. Alright, so we've been boiling now for about 40 minutes. So we got about 20-25 minutes left in that boil. So I'm going to be adding this vanilla bean into there because this is, after all, a vanilla porter. So I've already kind of slit one side of it open to be able to expose some of the seeds. So I'm just going to drop that guy right into there. We'll let it boil for about 20 minutes in there. I'm also going to, in about 5 minutes, be adding some Irish moss. I've got some little tablets of Irish moss, and that just helps to coagulate the proteins in there. It just basically helps you to clarify your beer. So it's going to allow those proteins to clump up, they'll fall to the bottom, and that way we can have a nice clear product. We've got a porter that we're drinking while we brew a porter, which is of course good luck. So in a few minutes, we'll be able to start cooling this thing down. Go. Alright, so we're cooling off this beer now. As you can see in here, we still have that copper coil. It's running through the beer. In fact, that vanilla bean's still in there. I just kind of shake it around. I occasionally give a stir here so that the liquid keeps moving around the copper coil. And then the water that runs off right here, I'm actually keeping that because it's nice hot water, so I'm able to use it to disinfect a lot of things after I'm done. It's good cleaning water. It hasn't touched the beer or anything like that, but it's nice and warm. So, yep, we're just getting the temperature down. Once this beer reaches, or the wort reaches about 68, 69 degrees, we'll be ready to pitch the yeast. Alright, so we've got the beer all now in here. The temperature is down to about 71 degrees. That's actually a pretty good temperature to be able to pitch this yeast into. You can go a little cooler than that because the yeast will actually create its own heat as it starts to reproduce and convert those sugars into alcohol. But 71 is great, and we've got a basement here that actually keeps it nice and cool. So we now just need to pitch the yeast and seal everything up. Kind of the important little side note here is how important disinfecting everything is. So we've got a really good disinfectant here. It's called Star San. It's made for brewers. It doesn't affect the flavor of any of the beer. It actually doesn't affect yeast at all. We could pitch yeast right into the spray bottle and it'd probably do just fine. It's really just meant to kill any sort of bacteria. So we spray everything down really well. With that, I'm going to spray down even this little corky here that's going to go in to plug that. And I spray down the hose here. And this is all going to be used as kind of a blowout tube so that pressure can be released once the yeast starts to reproduce in there. So now we're going to pitch that yeast. Alright, so now we're going to pitch that yeast. We've got everything cleaned off. The yeast that I'm going to pitch is the Fuller's ESB, so that's extra special bitter yeast from London. This is what Ninkasi actually uses for pretty much all of their ales. So if you're a home brewer and you want to be able to get some free yeast, you go to any brewer that is, worth their salt, and they'll probably give you a free sample. So I went to Ninkasi, had a jar, asked them if I could bum some yeast off them. They filled this sucker right up. So this is more than enough, but this is a pretty high gravity ale, so it's nice to be able to have a real big yeast starter like this to pitch. So you can see it's kind of cheesy looking stuff. That's a thick culture of yeast. We're probably talking about at least 500 billion cells of yeast in here. We're just going to dump that stuff right in. There we go. And it'll sink its way down, and it'll start, once it starts to reproduce down there, it's actually going to start self-churning. It's going to have just this awesome movement. Now with this plastic bucket you can't usually see it, but if you use a glass carboy where you're actually able to see from the inside, you can actually see that it starts to spin and spin and spin. It gets really turbulent. So, but we're going to put this on here, and of course everything on the inside of that was all disinfected on the inside there, so it's very, very clean. Nothing that can get in there. A nice big yeast starter like that will mean that we're starting to produce alcohol so fast in there that most bacteria won't even have a chance to start in there, which is great. So now I'm going to put that little tube, which I just sprayed with disinfectant as well. It'll come right out of the top over here. The other end is going to go in a little glass of water just to make sure nothing can fly out, but we need to be able to release gas, as well as make sure that if this thing kind of overflows with foam, because it becomes such a you know, turbulent beer, then we want to make sure that foam has somewhere to go. So it'll go down the tube, it'll dump right into the glass. So that's really it.